Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio visual podcast series on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio visual podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multi-dimensional genius. Each of the speech is approximately 20 minutes, and there are in all about 54 speeches. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had seen for the country. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, having covered Dr. Ambedkar's role as the principal architect of the Indian Constitution in as many as 10 episodes, I now turn to Dr. Ambedkar's role as the first Law Minister of India and a champion of the gender equality. On August 3, 1947, the names of the Council of Ministers of the central government were announced. And the then Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's cabinet included Dr. Ambedkar as the Law Minister of India. One of the early responsibilities of Dr. Ambedkar as the Law Minister was to streamline the working of the Constituent Assembly, which was already functioning since December 9, 1946, and of which Dr. Ambedkar was a member. On August 29, 1947, Dr. Ambedkar moved the Constituent Assembly, presenting a report on the functions of the Constituent Assembly under the Indian Independence Act of 1947. This committee report had made several important recommendations, which included two very important ones. First, that the committee was open to the Constituent Assembly to function as legislature and that it should function as such. And the second one, the work of the Constituent Assembly as a constitution-making body and as an ordinary legislature should be separated and should be conducted in separate sessions to be held on separate days. So here it is. What they did was the Constituent Assembly, which was elected by indirect method, and it had about 298 members, it was agreed that they would play a double role. On one hand, they would work as an ordinary legislature, a normal parliament, so to say, and on the other hand, they will also conduct their main function of making the Constitution. These two things were going to happen simultaneously, albeit on different dates. As the first Law Minister of independent India, Dr. Ambedkar actively participated in the deliberation of the Central Legislative Assembly, not only when the subject matter pertained to his own ministry, that is, Law Ministry, but also on several other occasions given his wide-ranging experience. Inside the Central Legislative Assembly and outside, Dr. Ambedkar always insisted to strictly follow the constitutional principles, and countrywide lectures that he delivered, he insisted on strictly following the constitutional principles. The most controversial part of Dr. Ambedkar's activities in the turmoil of the early post-independent years was his effort to get the Hindu Code Bill passed. This piece of legislation was in many ways the culmination of a century of legislative efforts to reform the tradition of the Hindu society, from the abolition of sati in 1829 to the Hindu Women's Right to Property Act of 1937. Dr. Ambedkar had hoped that it would emerge as one of the cornerstones of modern India. During the debates in the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar had demonstrated his firm resolve to reform Indian society by recommending the adoption of a common civil code, a subject that has become very relevant now. He vehemently opposed members, especially the Muslim representatives, who were strongly in favor of maintaining personal laws. However, Dr. Ambedkar could get nothing more in the constitutional process than an article in the Directive Principles of State Policy, which states that the state shall endeavor to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. This was what Dr. Ambedkar achieved in the Constituent Assembly. But now that he was the first Minister of Law, what happened was in 1948, the Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, entrusted the drafting of the Hindu Code Bill to a subcommittee of the Constituent Assembly and nominated Dr. Ambedkar as the chairman of the committee. In the revised draft Hindu Code Bill, Dr. Ambedkar incorporated as essential principles equality between men and women as regards property and adoption, legal status only to monogamous marriages, and elimination of the caste bar on the civil marriages, as also the need for a concrete justification for a petition for divorce. The Hindu Code Bill indeed was an effort at unprecedented comprehensive social reform that was championed by Dr. Ambedkar in the Parliament for nearly 4 years. The points that arose out of the bill for consideration and which were new were the following. First, abolition of birthright and not to take property by survivorship. The second point that arose for consideration was giving of half the share to the daughter. Thirdly, the conversion of the women's limited estate into an absolute estate. Fourthly, abolition of caste in the matter of marriage and adoption. Fifthly, the principle of monogamy. And sixthly, the principle of divorce. Dr. Ambedkar submitted the revised Hindu Code Bill to the Constituent Assembly in October 1948. It was going to have a difficult history, to say the least. The bill gave rise to a widespread and bitter controversy. The questioning of customs governing the private lives of Hindus led to a hue and cry in the name of protection of religious beliefs. This continued for nearly 3 years. While the bill remained pending under the contentious debate, with the orthodox attacking it by proclaiming the sacred nature of Hindu marriage. Marriage, and the family were declared as the true foundation of Hindu society, and the proponents of this belief argued that dissolving a marriage would ruin a society that had endured for millennia. In October 1950, Dr. Ambedkar circulated among the members of parliament a 39-page booklet containing the nature and scope of the changes in the Hindu Code Bill, revised in the light of representations received from various Hindu organizations throughout the country. He also delivered speeches in various fora in different parts of the country which aimed at building consensus. There were no signs of the controversy dying out. President of India, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, in his letter to Sardar Patel, had expressed strong reservations against the Hindu Code Bill, pointing out that, and I quote, new concepts and new ideas that are not only foreign to the Hindu law, but they are susceptible to dividing every family. Dr. Prasad apparently privately campaigned against the bill on the grounds that the members of provisional parliament did not have the mandate to address this critical issue. Congress president at that time, Pattabhi Sitaramayya, also opposed the bill on the grounds that it would alienate the party's support base on the eve of general elections of 1951 and 52. On the other hand, Prime Minister Nehru strongly supported the bill and had even declared that his government would resign if the Hindu Code Bill were not passed in the parliament. This was despite the fact that Sardar Patel had declared his stern opposition to the bill, had even announced that the bill would not be taken up in the parliament at all. On August 10, 1951, Dr. Ambedkar wrote to the Prime Minister and said that in his letter that his health was causing him anxiety and that he was keen that the bill be taken up in the parliament on priority. In response, the Prime Minister stated that there was opposition to the bill both inside the government as well as outside, and it should be taken up in the parliament at the beginning of September 1951. In order to diffuse the opposition, Prime Minister Nehru proposed strategically to split the code into 4 subsets. It was decided that the marriage and divorce part of the Hindu Code Bill would be treated as a separate bill and would be taken up in the parliament on September 17, 1951. The truncated Hindu Code Bill in the form of Marriage and Divorce Bill was hotly debated in the parliament. The debate demonstrated the hostility that had built up amongst the most traditionalist congressmen. After 4 days of discussion, Dr. Ambedkar made an impassioned speech on September 20th, 1951. Responding to the criticism, Dr. Ambedkar asserted that the arguments about the unchanged nature of Hindu society and its survival meant nothing. Rather, he pointed out that the question of quality of what had survived. The new marriage system proposed was not, he argued, an imitation of the West, but was based on the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity enshrined in the Constitution. In contrast, he reasoned that, and I quote him, sacramental marriage of the traditionalist is polygamy for the man and a perpetual slavery for the woman. Unquote. The bill finally failed. Pandit Nehru, who had vowed to support it, never issued a whip and was clearly unable and unwilling to bring the traditionally minded members of the Congress into line. A little later, Dr. Ambedkar attributed Pandit Nehru's backtracking to pressure from the Congress party. Dr. Ambedkar said in a statement, and I quote him, "I have never seen a case of chief whip so disloyal to the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister so loyal to a disloyal whip." Unquote. There is a view that Pandit Nehru feared that Congress MPs would reject the bill en masse. President Dr. Rajendra Prasad would indeed carry out the threat not to promulgate it as a law. Dr. Ambedkar, ailing and disgusted, resigned from his seat in the cabinet on September 27, and in his resignation letter to the Prime Minister, he stated, and I quote, "For a long time I have been thinking about resigning from my seat from the cabinet. The only thing that had held me back from giving effect to my intention was the hope that it would be possible to give effect to the Hindu Code Bill before the life of the present Parliament comes to an end. I even agreed to break up the bill and restricted it to marriage and divorce in the fond hope that at least this much of our labor may bear fruit. But even that part of the bill has been killed. So I see no purpose in my continuing to be a member of your cabinet." Unquote. As a matter of fact, Dr. Ambedkar had said to his colleagues when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru initially said that no matter what, I will stand by you, even if the government falls, we are with you. I am with you as the Prime Minister, and we will get this revolutionary bill passed. But then, when Pandit Nehru started backtracking, and when he broke it up into two, marriage and divorce as one part and the remaining one as the second part, and put it out as a separate bill, when he asked Dr. Ambedkar's permission, Dr. Ambedkar agreed in principle, and there he quoted to his colleagues, "Sarvanashe samutpanne ardhyam tajati panditaha." When everything is about to be lost, a wise man is contented with half of it. So he was contented, but later backtracked on the remaining part as well, and that is when, furious, annoyed, and agitated, Dr. Ambedkar resigned from the cabinet. As a matter of civility to the Prime Minister and to the cabinet, Dr. Ambedkar expressed his willingness to continue till motions standing in his name were finished. Jawaharlal Nehru ji agreed to accept his resignation from the last date of the ongoing session after appreciating his hard labor and indicated that the fates and the rules of procedure were against the Hindu Code Bill. Later, in a surprise move, Pandit Nehru asked for a copy of Dr. Ambedkar's parting speech in advance. In response, Dr. Ambedkar informed the Prime Minister on October 4, 1951, that if he prepared a speech, he would give an advance copy to the Prime Minister, and that he had obtained the permission of the Deputy Speaker to make his statement on October 11, 1951. And now, when the Parliament began its session on October 11th, at some point, Dr. Ambedkar rose to speak. Surprisingly, the Deputy Speaker ruled that he would have been allowed to speak at that juncture only if he had submitted a copy of his statement to the chair earlier. When some MPs wondered aloud whether the behavior of the Deputy Speaker did not amount to pre-censorship in a departure from democratic and parliamentary traditions, the Deputy Speaker actually said that as a custodian of the rights and privileges of Parliament, it was necessary for him to see that the statement contained nothing irrelevant and libelous. Turning to Dr. Ambedkar, the Deputy Speaker continued, Honorable Minister, before he could proceed further, Dr. Ambedkar cut him off, retorting that he was no longer a minister and that he did not intend to submit to that kind of diktat. He collected his papers and stormed out of the house. After the walkout, Dr. Ambedkar distributed the copies of his statement to newspaper reporters. His statement cited 5 points on which he differed from the Union Cabinet. 1. Pandit Nehru left him out of every cabinet committee, even though as the Prime Minister, he had promised him the planning department, which came later as a planning commission, while including him in the cabinet. Second, the apathy of the Congress government towards the uplift of the scheduled caste. Third, unwillingness of the government to bring about the right solution for the Kashmir issue. Fourth, the wrong foreign policy of India, which increased enemies rather than friends. And fifth, Pandit Nehru's lukewarm policy towards the Hindu Code Bill. Dr. Ambedkar categorically stated that it was his impression that Prime Minister Nehru, though sincere, had lacked the earnestness and determination required to get the Hindu Code Bill through. The failure of the Hindu Code Bill perhaps made Dr. Ambedkar realize that although the Congress party had approved the constitutional framework for parliamentary democracy, most congressmen were not prepared to support concrete advances that called the social status quo into question. Clearly, it must have demonstrated to him that the economic radicalism that was shown by the emergence of a planned, state-directed and substantially state-owned economy was not matched by social radicalism as yet. Dr. Ambedkar concluded his statement by saying that, and I quote, the Hindu Code Bill was the greatest social reform measure ever undertaken by the legislature in this country. No law in the past or the future can be compared to it in its significance. To leave inequality between class and class, between sex and sex, which is the soul of Hindu society, untouched, and to go on passing legislations relating to economic problems is to make a farce out of the Constitution and to build a palace on a dung heap. Although Dr. Ambedkar resigned from the Union Cabinet of Ministers, please note here that many of the things that Dr. Ambedkar had proposed in the Hindu Code Bill were done as a prelude to the Uniform Civil Code, and many of the things proposed were actually approved within 10 years after his resignation. This only goes to show how much ahead of time Dr. Ambedkar was. Although Dr. Ambedkar resigned from the Union Cabinet of Ministers on the issue of gender equality, which he had sought to achieve through the Hindu Code Bill, hardly anybody in India, including women's organizations, hardly anybody gives him any credit as the champion of gender equality. He was a leader of untouchables only, after all. Well, friends, let me conclude this session here. But before I leave, I would like to urge you, if you like this audio-visual podcast series, Bhim Bhashya, like it, share it, subscribe to it. So long until we meet again real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.